Welcome to Dark Literature Recap, where I read dark and disturbing books so that you don't have to. Today, I'll be analyzing and discussing the novel Tender is the Flesh. This book, written by, and I hope I don't butcher her name, Augustina Bazterrica, is a horror and political novel that criticizes the practice of factory farming by replacing animals with humans. Before we get into it, just letting you know right out the gate that I am recovering from the flu, so I apologize if my voice is a little bit more hoarse this time around. But I found this book very interesting, and I really wanted to talk about it, soon after reading the book so I don't forget what was in it. So, really wanted to get this out, even though I'm not feeling particularly well. So, I apologize if there's a dip in quality for this episode compared to what people are used to. Now, this review, as always, is going to be very heavy on spoilers, so if you don't want to be spoiled, don't listen past this timestamp here. Now, I will put a disclaimer right now before we even get started that I personally have a bias towards liking this book, and anyone who is a cynic like me will probably feel similarly. One of Tender is the Flesh's biggest draws is that it has a very pessimistic view of humanity, and it's intentionally very illogical at times. At its core, the book is about a near future in which a virus infects every animal on the planet. These animals act as a carrier for the virus, where the animal itself isn't affected by the virus, but any human who comes in contact with the infected animal quickly succumbs to the pathogen and dies. Now, ask yourself this before we get started. In a world where nearly every animal is toxic to humans and therefore inedible, what do you think is the most logical response? I'd be willing to wager that you probably came to the conclusion that humanity should either A, devote all of its resources towards curing the virus, or B, quickly restructure their agricultural and farming industry towards a meatless diet. Instead, this book assumes that humanity is way too greedy and selfish to universally convert to veganism, and that we would instead not only have widespread instances of cannibalism, but go as far as to legalize and industrialize the process. Now, whether or not you agree with this prediction will determine your relationship with the book. If you're someone who thinks that this is insane and completely unrealistic, I honestly can't recommend reading the book. The entire time you'll be scoffing and rolling your eyes at how absurd and ridiculous of a notion it is. However, if you're a cynic who believes that this is something humanity could resort to, then you should stop this video and read the book. I'll be the first to admit that the book goes a little off the rails as you kind of progress, but the first half of the book is a fascinating deep dive into the depravity and savagery of humanity. Now, with that out of the way, and without further ado, here is a review of Tender is the Flesh. Before we start, though, a viewer discretion warning. Warning. The following book contains references to or explicit depictions of violence, rape of children, murder of children, sex trafficking, blood, gore, kidnapping and abduction, cannibalism, forced impregnation, and torture. Viewer discretion is advised. There are no good characters in Tender is the Flesh. Every character, from our main character Marcos to the side characters that surround him, are some flavor of evil. Throughout the book, we have the opportunity to witness Marco's evil firsthand, and it is easy to assume that he is the most evil person in this book. However, we constantly get reminders from side characters and hints on the background world as a whole, showing us that everyone is a sinner in this world. We just so happen to be zooming in on Marcos. I want you to keep that in mind as we begin our journey into Tender is the Flesh. In the not-so-distant future, a deadly virus has infected every single animal on Earth, except for humans. This virus, for reasons we are not privy to until the end of the novel, only harms humans. The infected animals are instead carriers for the disease, and any interaction with an animal, whether it be physical contact or consumption, can lead to the virus spreading to a person. In response to this devastating virus, the governments of the world decided to legalize human cannibalism, doing this in order to protect the meat industry. These human beings, who are used for consumption and slaughter, have been renamed heads, and the meat they produce has been branded as special meat. These human beings are specifically placed in a world and environment in which they are dehumanized as much as possible. They cannot speak, they do not have names, and their entire lives have been in a factory. The sole purpose of their existence is to be reared, fattened, and used as meat for other humans who are lucky enough to not share their fate. However, a factory cannot operate without workers. Marcos, our protagonist, is not just one of these workers, but is a high-level manager at one of the largest human processing factories in the country. He does this to care for his father with dementia, but that does not make the work any easier. Marcos is a miserable man with a miserable job. He is tasked with making sure that human lives are slaughtered efficiently, on schedule, and that they produce the highest quality meat possible. Although Marcos justifies his action by using the money he makes to care for his father, it still affects every area of his life. This includes his marriage. It is revealed to us throughout the novel that Marcos and his wife are separated. For a vast majority of the novel, she's not even present, spending months living with her mother after the death of their child, a child who may have been the only one they could naturally conceive. But regardless of how miserable his life is, the work must be done. The people must be fed. One day, Marcos is given a terrible gift, one that even he does not want to keep. From a business associate, he is gifted a breeding female head. She is from a strong genetic line, and Marcos must make the decision as to whether he will slaughter her for food or dispose of her. Instead of choosing either of these choices, Marcos commits one of the greatest sins a person in this new world can. He keeps her. After this, Marcos goes to clear his head at a place that used to bring him joy and comfort as a child. He visits his local zoo. The zoo is run down and decrepit, as in this new world, there is no place for animals, whether they be in captivity or in the wild. While there, Marcos is confronted by a group of dogs. Ignoring every warning hammered into every citizen of this new world, Marcos decides to play with the dogs, resigned to his fate of getting infected with the virus and dying. He waits for oblivion, but oblivion never comes. We learn here that the virus was a lie. We don't know the motivation of this lie, but there is no virus, there is no disease, and humanity did not need to resort to cannibalism. Realizing that the virus is a lie, Marcos begins to escalate his atrocities. He returns home and has sex with a confused and frightened Jasmine, the name that he has given to the female head living with him, committing yet another one of this world's most fundamental of taboos. Jasmine, having the mental development of a child, or perhaps more accurately, that of an animal, cannot consent to this. But that does not matter to Marcos. 8 months later, Jasmine is heavily pregnant with Marcos's child and is living in his home with him in secret. At this point, Marcos's descent into madness is more of a plummet. When his father finally succumbs to his illness, the facade of sanity for Marcos is finally broken. He loses all interest in his job, his relationship with his wife, or anything else in the world aside for Jasmine and his soon-to-be-born child. Even as health inspectors begin to suspect that Marcos may be illegally keeping a head in his home as a sex slave, this does not deter Marcos from his goal. Finally, the day arrives. Jasmine has gone into labor. Marcos calls his wife, who is a medical professional experienced in deliveries, and tells her to come over. She arrives and, although deeply in shock as to what is happening, helps deliver Jasmine's baby. Marcos's baby. Marcos finally reveals to us what all of this was leading up to. After the delivery, he steals the child from a weeping Jasmine and kills her. He then proposes to his wife that they raise Jasmine's child together to be the child that they were never able to have and keep. And that is the end of Tender is the Flesh. There is no happy ending, there is no redemption, and there are no good characters. A nightmarish story of abuse, murder, and rape has finally come to a blessed end. Tender is the Flesh is a thought-provoking, nonsensical novel. In some aspects, people behave as you would expect them to behave. They're selfish and shallow and lacking even the barest threads of a conscience. And in other ways, they are ridiculous, nonsensical, and, quite frankly, stupid. And that, more than anything, makes this one of the most disturbing novels I've ever read. Whew! Book's a lot, and anyone who has read the book knows that I glossed over a lot of details, but I encourage you to read the book if you haven't, even if the ending has been spoiled for you. There are so many details, side characters, and moments in the book that add to the world that I simply don't have time to touch on. But what I do have time to touch on is how disturbing this book was. And I won't mince words, this book was fucked up. From almost start to finish, it is profoundly disturbing. Even the normal scenes of everyday life are bone-chilling, since cannibalism has either directly or indirectly infiltrated every facet of life in this new world. Now, for psychological horror and suspense, I personally give it an 8 out of 5 out of 10. This book utilizes tension and mounting dread expertly. You know that no matter what happens, things will end badly for Jasmine. You just don't know what's going to happen to her. We know that Marcos is unstable and dangerous, but we gain such little insight into who he is as a person and what motivates him that he really does seem capable of anything. There's also a background feeling of dread and fear throughout the book. The population of this world is terrified of every type of animal, from domesticated pets to wild birds. It's a really great use of tension that only loses points because it would have been nice to see more instances of people being terrified of animals and the greater outside world. For visceral horror, I give it an 8 out of 10. As a rule of thumb, I always give a book that makes me physically nauseous from the content of it an 8 out of 10, and this book did just that. It absolutely doesn't shy away from going into visceral details. The details of the slaughterhouse are particularly difficult to get through, and even the stories that some of the background characters tell are so vile and depraved that it's hard to stomach. There's a scene where Marcos meets up with a group of rich businessmen who tell stories of their exploits with trafficked human beings that is genuinely very hard to read. For taboo subjects, I give the book an 8.2 out of 10. The topics this book explored were phenomenal and deeply disturbing. The book explored everything from pedophilia to cannibalism to murder. Really, the only things it didn't explore were some of the more fetishistic sexual topics, extreme violence and brutality, and drug use. So, this book really touched on some of the most awful, taboo, and vile things a person can do to someone. Where it loses points is just in how these topics were handled. The book is very inconsistent. Some topics, like descriptions of factory farming and the depraved stories shared by those rich businessmen, were handled brilliantly. They were a perfect mix of sterile and clinical, while also being deeply disturbing and troubling. Others, like a violent attack that he committed against a butcher, which I didn't have time to go over in my summary, felt really out of place and like they were just there for shock value. Overall, I give the book an 8.3 out of 10 for how disturbing it was. Genuinely one of the most uncomfortable books I've ever read. Now, let's examine the plot. Personally, I give it a 7.8 out of 10. This book does a great job of pulling you into this morally bankrupt society. The plot also has a lot of twists and turns, but it's easy enough to follow along with and has a very clear beginning, middle, and end. However, the pacing is very inconsistent and sometimes frustrating. It's very slow and detailed for most of the book, and then there are these huge plot shifts and climaxes that shake up the entire narrative before going right back to being slow and detailed. For some moments, this works really well, like the chapters leading up to Marcos imprisoning Jasmine. Others feel jarring and like they were just there for shock value. Overall, it was more good than bad, but not every climax was handled equally. I also didn't like the plot twist at the end on a personal level, but that being said, I can objectively admit that it was unexpected and a well-foreshadowed twist, so it might just be my own personal bias. But overall, the book does a great job of presenting you with mysteries that you're genuinely intrigued by, and being patient with the reveal. For writing style, I give it an 8.5 out of 10. The writing style is clean and you never lose track of the narrative. It has a good balance of not being so academic and pretentious that you really can't follow along with it, while also not treating the reader like an idiot who needs to be hand-fed every single plot detail. The use of figurative language was also excellent. There's a quote from the book that I feel really encapsulates the entire sterile callousness of this world. His brain warns him that there are words that cover up the world. There are words that are convenient, hygienic, legal. And the book is full of moments like this that help elevate the writing and flesh out the cold hopelessness of this world. Really great stuff. Which leads us to the world building itself. It's an easy 9 out of 10. The world building and tone of this book might just be the strongest draw it has. Augustina creates a very interesting and engaging world. It's bleak and pessimistic, and unfortunately, in many ways, too realistic. And it's way too easy to understand the selfish and callous thought process that went into deciding to eat people instead of just giving up meat, and the way that this society goes from horrified and reluctant to accepting is really close to how cultures normalize evil. The world has a disturbing amount of internal consistency. Augustina doesn't just explain how the world changed in the face of legalized cannibalism, but she explains why it changed and the effect that these institutional changes had on the people living in it. It's extremely believable and well executed. The only reason I'm taking off even 1 point is because I want to see more and explore this world from a different perspective than just Marcos, who's kind of a boring character. Speaking of characters, the characterization of this novel is where things start to break down a little. I give it a 6.5 out of 10, mostly due to, like I said, Marcos. He is a bizarre character. He's really hard to understand, which isn't a bad thing on its own, but it makes some of his behaviors difficult to understand. An important and actually appreciated aspect of his character is that Marcos is a man of scarcity. He's a neutral mask that conveys nothing to the side characters. And even his internal monologues and thoughts aren't very detailed at times. This is great as it presents a unique perspective that you really don't see often in a main character, but it makes it so that we have very little context for the rationale of some of his later actions. The side characters are honestly more interesting, and they help with the overall character development in the novel. We learn so much about the world and Marcos himself through the people who live around him. We learn that Marcos is viewed as a shady and kind of evil person based off how uncomfortable he makes others, and how most other evil people readily tell him about the atrocities they commit because they just assume that he's one of them. We learn how secretly fucked up everyone is from his interactions with his sister and her absolutely terrible children. The side characters are really the heart of the book. I just wish that we got more interactions with them. For themes and messaging, I have some kind of confusing thoughts about the themes and messaging in this book. The book honestly almost nails it, but it has a few serious flaws. Firstly, the themes of this book are very narrow in scope. There are some universal themes like struggling to adapt to a changing world and political/capitalistic corruption, but the brunt of the book is focused on themes around farming, consumption, and selfishness, which are good themes, but they're very specific. I honestly wish that the book had branched out a little bit more and done a more in-depth analysis on some of the more universal themes, like maybe the morality of complying with an obviously corrupt system, or the existential crisis of discovering that everything you were told about the world was a lie. The book touches on these themes, but it never really commits to exploring them. However, I do need to concede that the very specific themes of political corruption and modern-day barbarism are handled expertly. I'm a lifelong lover of meat and animal products, and this book not only made me think more carefully about what goes into the food I eat, but it even made me cut down significantly on my meat consumption and start buying overpriced meat from a local farmer. So, yeah, it's really effective at conveying its message. It's just that the message is very narrow in scope, and it would have been nice to see her kind of branch out to some other themes. So, overall, I give it a 7.2 out of 10. For editing, formatting, and design, this book is an easy 10 out of 10. The book is structured very well. I never found any grammatical or translation errors. For those who don't know, this book was originally written in Spanish. And the cover art is iconic and absolutely chilling. Easy 10 out of 10. For relevance and impact, this book does a great job, but it just hasn't been able to create any significant impact outside of the niche world of extreme horror, which is a shame because it's been out for years now. It's been highly praised by critics and reviewers. It was favorably reviewed by the New York Times and The Guardian, and it won Argentina's, and I'm sorry if I absolutely butcher this, Premio Clarín de Novela Prize. I am so sorry to any viewers who are Spanish speakers. It's also been making the rounds on TikTok, and it's a very impactful novel on a personal level. Like I said, this novel got me to actually rethink my relationship with meat. But outside of that, I really haven't found anything in my research to indicate that it has any influence on other works or it's branched out into other forms of media. There's not exactly a tender as the flesh movie out in theaters right now. So for that, I give it a 7.3 out of 10. If it's able to get more momentum and kind of get more into the mainstream, it would easily be an 8 or even a 9 out of 10. For reading experience and accessibility, this book is not suited for anyone who isn't an adult with a strong stomach, but that does not cost it points in this series. It's very approachable, hitting a good balance of not being written with an overly simplistic tone, but also not being so complex and cerebral that most people would be intimidated by it. It's really approachable. It's also not particularly hard to get your hands on a copy of it. I read a free copy of it using Libby, but you can easily get a copy off Amazon. However, what I will take points off for is that it's a little expensive, especially since it's not that long of a book. So for that, I give it a 7 out of 10. Bring the price down a little bit, and that score would shoot up. In conclusion, I give Tender is the Flesh a rating of 8.1 out of 10. Compared to its Goodreads score of 7.56, this is a little high, which makes sense. Like I said in the beginning, I have a bias. If you're also a cynic and a pessimist, this book scratches a very particular itch in your brain where instead of it feeling absurd and impossible, it's chilling in its realism, and it's an unflinching acceptance of just raw human selfishness. The entire novel could have been averted if the world had simply converted to veganism, and how likely you think it is that the world would do this would heavily influence your enjoyment of the novel. It's a dark, twisted, depraved book that shook me to the core and presented a fantastic world with characters that were ridiculous and irrational, but fun to read about. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any recommendations for other books you'd like to see in the series, please leave your suggestions in the comment section below. In the next book, we finally enter into the world of body horror and modern internet relationships, with a twist ending that honestly makes Tender is the Flesh look like a children's book. Until then, take care.